Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is the third and final video in my series going through the Lord of the Rings movies, showing changes that were made by Peter Jackson that created plot holes or similar problems. So, this being the third, this will be on the Return of the King. And I should warn you up front for this one, there are quite a lot of problems that I found in the movie. Most of them don't raise huge plot holes, some of them are kind of minor, but a lot of the stuff that I point out is actually only in the extended edition. So that may have been somewhat true for the Two Towers as well, but I don't think there was a whole lot of extended cut material there. In here, several items are definitely only extended cut. So if you haven't seen the extended cut, you may not want to watch this one in case you don't want to be spoiled, or you may just want to skip certain parts because they won't make sense. That being said, let me go ahead and get started, and we'll get through the Return of the King and the plot holes created by Peter Jackson. Starting off our list is a scene from the extended cut, and this particular scene comes basically right at the beginning of the movie with Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the Riders of Rohan coming to Isengard to confront Saruman. In the non-extended cut, the theatrical version, they basically just tell Treebeard Saruman has to stay here and they leave. But in the extended cut, they actually have some conversation with Saruman. Gandalf tries to get information out of him, basically saying, "You were deep in the enemy's council. We want to know where he's going to strike next." In the novel, this is not really how it goes down, because in the novel, Saruman is actually a traitor to Sauron as well as to the free peoples of Middle-earth. He was basically trying to get the ring for himself. In the movies, you get the idea that he was always kind of loyal to Sauron and never really betrayed him in any sense. So that's the change that is at least implied in this scene, and that creates a few problems. One of those being Gandalf is, basically acting like Saruman is actually going to give them information. Why would Saruman give them information if he actually is loyal to Sauron? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And Saruman actually kind of acts like he would do it, at the very end of the scene, right before he gets, spoilers, killed by Grima Wormtongue. And so the question arises, why would Saruman do that? I mean, he's safe in Orthanc. Nobody can actually get to him. And what motive does he have to give up any information? If he thinks Sauron is still going to win, he thinks he's still going to be on the winning side. But if he gives up the information, he will be a traitor to Sauron. So that's a problem. The other problem is Gandalf is basically acting here like he doesn't have any idea what Sauron is going to do next. Now, even in the context of just the movie itself, it's pretty clear that Sauron has been moving against Gondor for quite some time, and Gandalf knows this, or at least should know it, because there's been war going on between Gondor and Mordor for, at least a while. They've been, Sauron was trying to take Osgiliath. There's a scene in the extended cut, maybe even the theatrical cut of the Two Towers, that shows before Boromir ever set out on his journey to Rivendell that there was an attack on Osgiliath. You would think Gandalf would know about this, even just within the context of the movie. Second, you would also tend to assume, just logically, that if Sauron is going to strike next, it's going to be against Gondor, because Gondor is the main kingdom of men that has any real resistance, the ability to resist him. So there's all kinds of reasons why Gandalf ought to already know the answer to the question he's posing. But the final problem here is, if Gandalf doesn't already know that Sauron is moving against Minas Tirith, how does he then know to tell Aragorn just a little bit later on in the movie that he has to come to Minas Tirith by another road and look to the black ships? He's talking about the Corsairs of Umbar, of course, who are coming up the river to aid in the attack against Minas Tirith. How would he know about the black ships but not know about the attack on Gondor? Now, the black ships bit comes in after the scene where Pippin has looked in the Palantir, and there's no indication that Pippin saw the black ships, so there's no indication that Gandalf got that information from Pippin, so he knew it independently. Now, you could maybe argue that, he knew it, he inferred it because of what Pippin told him about Gondor, and that therefore he inferred that the ships would come against Gondor. But why would you infer the black ships just for Gondor? I mean, you would think that would be something that would be relevant no matter where, because the river Anduin basically goes up all the way to the north. So I mean, if he's going to attack Rohan, he'll have to cross that river. If he attacks the elves, it'll have to cross that river. The only ones he wouldn't have to cross the river for, I suppose, would be the dwarves in Erebor and the men of Dale and the Woodland realm. But even there, it would still be an assistance, because the river is still close enough that if the Corsairs came north, they would be able to do something. So Gandalf knows about these ships that are going to be attacking Gondor, but he doesn't know that Sauron is going to be attacking Gondor. It doesn't make any sense. Where does he get this knowledge? And you definitely do get the idea that Gandalf sees things, you know, by some magic or whatever. So you get this idea that he has this knowledge, and yet he's clueless about what it means. So that's kind of the multifarious plot holes or weird issues created by Sauron and Saruman not being at odds with each other in the movies. Let's move on to something different. This next one is also from the extended cut only, and it's really a small one, but there's a scene after the victorious Rohirrim and everyone return to Edoras that Legolas and Gimli have a drinking game. And the way they set this up, you get the idea that Legolas has no clue what a drinking game is. You're not even sure he knows what beer is, or ale, or whatever it is they're drinking. And in the course of the drinking game, Gimli, of course, drinks a huge pile of cups of whatever it is, as does Legolas. But Legolas, unlike Gimli, doesn't get drunk. At the end, after drinking, probably a dozen mugs, basically says, "I feel something in my fingers. I think it's affecting me," as if elves are not really affected by alcohol the way that mortals are. Now, this doesn't create a problem within the context of the movie itself, but anybody who's read The Hobbit knows that in The Hobbit, when Bilbo is trying to rescue the dwarves from the Woodland Realm prison, he waits till a bunch of elves get drunk so that he can then get the keys, which he uses to free the dwarves and then escape in barrels. Now, this also happens in the Hobbit movies, so since those are in the same universe, same director, and everything else, it does create a contradiction within Peter Jackson's own work. And what that ends up meaning is you either have to assume that the Woodland Elves drank an enormous quantity of alcohol, in which case, how do they keep themselves supplied? Or you have to assume that Peter Jackson just wasn't really thinking when he made this drinking game scene and made Legolas basically immune to alcohol. Let's face it, he shouldn't really be immune to alcohol. They didn't drink that much alcohol in the Hobbit movie to get drunk in the Woodland Realm. It just creates a problem. Like I said, a really small one, but it was needless to change this in the movie, because we already know from The Hobbit that elves can perfectly well get drunk. And why do that? I mean, it adds some humor, but you can add humor without having to make contradictions with the story. And let's move on to another relatively minor point. Also, after the Rohirrim return to Edoras, Pippin eventually looks into the Palantir. Now, the contradiction here with the novel is, in the novel, Pippin looks in the Palantir while they're still on their way back from Isengard to Edoras. And he does so when everybody else is asleep. Nobody's there to see him do it. The only thing that wakes everybody up is during the process, he cries out because of either pain, fear, or who knows what. It's not really made clear. In the movie, however, Merry sees him going for the Palantir. And so the problem raised here, it's not a plot hole, but it just doesn't make any sense. Merry is watching him do this the whole time, doesn't try to stop him, other than telling him, "Don't do it." Yeah, that worked really well. And then he sees Pippin doing this, and he sees that something not good is happening, and yet he just kind of sits there, and he sits there, and he says stuff relatively quietly, and then finally something happens to wake everybody up. It's like, Merry, if you see something going on, why aren't you trying to wake everybody up so you can actually prevent more bad from happening than is necessary? It's just, like I said, not a plot hole, but it's just stupid the way it plays out, because Merry is basically not doing anything to help the situation. Shifting gears away from Rohan for a bit, we come to Faramir's doomed charge against Osgiliath, which has been overrun by the forces of Mordor. Now, the scene is and the setup for it are similar to the way the novel goes down. The key difference here is that in the novel, when Denethor has Faramir go back to Osgiliath, Osgiliath is still technically held by Gondor, or at least the Western Bank is. Whereas in the movie, the orcs have already completely overrun the river in the Western Bank. They hold Osgiliath. And the problem this creates is, why would Denethor be so stupid as to send a relatively small group of horsemen against Osgiliath, which is now completely held by orcs, thinking that they're going to be able to stop anything? I mean, they're riding across an open plain against a semi-fortified location, and he expects them to achieve what exactly? I mean, in the novel, there's at least some value to continuing to defend Osgiliath because there is a river there that provides some extra protection. It's not just sending men uselessly into battle. Faramir gets wounded almost mortally in both cases, but in the novel, at least, it's because the orcs just completely overwhelm them over time. Whereas here, it's because there was no chance of him not getting either injured, killed, or captured, no matter what you do. So it just makes Denethor look like a complete moron in terms of military tactics because, he's saying he doesn't want to yield the Pelennor in the river unfought. He says the same thing in the novel, but in the novel, they still have it. They still have the river in the Pelennor, whereas here, they basically already lost it, and he's just... You get the idea that the only real motivation is that he's sending Faramir out there because he'd almost rather him die. So, but that doesn't make any sense either because as bad as Denethor is, he doesn't really want Faramir to die. He doesn't particularly like Faramir, but it is clear that whenever Faramir is brought back and seems to be dead, that he does care about him to some degree. So you just really can't make that work. So now let's move again and talk about Frodo. Alright, now you could probably already guess where I'm going with Frodo because I think I've talked about this in a previous video, and if you've seen it, you know that I absolutely hate the fact that Peter Jackson changed the plot line and characters between Gollum, Sam, and Frodo, and how Gollum poisons Frodo against Sam, and then Frodo sends Sam home, and all this other mess. Completely against the way it happens in the novel. And the problems it creates are twofold. One, as far as just the poisoning against Sam by itself, it doesn't make any sense that Gollum would be able to do this because Frodo knows Sam well enough to know that he is above everything loyal to Frodo. Now, yes, when it comes to the ring, he does have issues with Sam because if Sam asks for the ring, offers to help with it, anything like that, he gets all super paranoid like the ring does. It makes you fear that sort of thing because it wants you to keep it. That's what the ring does. But the ring doesn't make you see everybody in a completely opposite light. It just makes you see the person who wants the ring as the bad guy. Now, that being said, the way it operates here in these particular scenes is it makes him trust Gollum, which makes no sense, and distrust Sam, who hasn't even asked for the ring yet. So there's weird dynamics going on. And Frodo is also not an idiot in terms of knowing what Gollum is capable of. He knows he's not trustworthy. And in the movie, you get the idea that he just comes to trust Gollum over time and stop trusting Sam. And you can see, after watching The Return of the King, you can see them start to build that up in The Two Towers, where Sam is a little overly hostile to Gollum compared to the novel. And then, you can see how they're trying to turn that into Frodo is looking back and seeing how Sam is really the bad guy in the situation. But again, it doesn't really make sense because Frodo is not an idiot. And like I said, the ring doesn't just twist your entire view of reality. It just affects those situations where somebody else appears to be going after the ring. That's really all it does. And yet they turn it into something completely different here. Now, the other aspect of this, and that gets a little more concrete, is the way that Gollum finally gets Frodo to finally get rid of Sam is he takes the lembas bread, crumbles it up onto Sam's sleeping body, so that he can find the crumbs there, and then throws the rest of it overboard as a way of basically getting Frodo to finally distrust Sam. Now, this doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. Sam, why would he bring up the fact that there's no more bread if he's the one that ate it? I mean, this is just illogical. But the bigger problem is if they lost all the elven bread, and Sam says in the scene that, or no, Frodo says in the scene actually, that's all we had left, how do they make it to Mount Doom? I mean, in the novel, it is kind of explained that there are places along the road that they find water, but there's really not much of any indication that they find food anywhere, and there's no indication of finding either food or water in the movie. So you have to really make some big assumptions about, this barren wasteland that is Mordor that you see in the movie to get any idea of how did they make it there. Now, true, they kind of make the trip look like it only took a day or two, but that's really not accurate, and anybody who looked at the map would know that that's not possible. So you could explain it by saying the trip didn't take that long, but then you've got a contradiction with, it takes them 40 days to get from Rivendell down to, or well, maybe not 40 days, but it takes them a good while to get from Rivendell to Moria, which is, not that different than the distance from Minas Morgul to Mount Doom. So, now you've got a contradiction between timeline and distance. So, I mean, no matter how you cut it, there's a contradiction somewhere, and it just doesn't make sense. And speaking of Denethor being a moron when it comes to military strategy, there's also the problem of the lighting of the beacons and all of that stuff. Now, some of this is in the extended cut only, but the main thrust of it is in the theatrical version, so you'll get it either way. Denethor in the movie apparently doesn't want to light the beacons to alert Rohan that they need military assistance. I am at a loss to explain why that decision would be made. I mean, it doesn't make any sense on its own terms. We know that Denethor is very much in love with the idea of staying the steward of Gondor, because he flat out tells Gandalf he's not going to bow to this ranger from the north. And so he says the rule of Gondor is mine and no others. You can't rule over a place that's been totally annihilated and you've been conquered by an enemy. So he wants to rule, and he has this idea, and you can see it too in his Doom charge that he sends Faramir on, that he is still trying to fight. But if he's trying to fight, then why doesn't he light the beacons? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, and it turns a lot of things upside down. Of course, then the beacons are lit by Pippin, which again doesn't make sense. In the novel, they were already lit before Gandalf and Pippin even arrived at Minas Tirith, because duh, what are you gonna do? The problem this creates is not only that Denethor is a complete moron, but then you get the scene later on where the hosts of Mordor are outside and Denethor looks out and sees them, and he just suddenly loses it. And he says that Theoden's betrayed me. Now you could put that down to he's kind of lost his marbles because Faramir has come back and appears to be dead. But, you've already got the other problems where he didn't want to light the beacons in the first place, and it's just so weird. And so him saying that, Theoden's betrayed me, it reminds you of the scene earlier in the movie where Theoden's like, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? You didn't ask him for help. I mean, it's like, how can you be betrayed by somebody that you haven't even tried to enlist as an ally? It doesn't even make any sense. So, I mean, this entire thing about the beacons, there's no reason for him not to light them, and there's no reason for him to then say that Theoden has betrayed him when it wasn't even his choice to light the beacons. I mean, it's just nonsense all the way through. Here's another one that's kind of minor, but I think it's a little weird. You've got a scene where, when this is after Éowyn has, defeated the Witch King, following that, Éowyn actually talks to Theoden, who is about to, die. He's been crushed by his horse and is mortally wounded, and he's about to die, but Éowyn comes up and they talk, and it's a really touching scene. It's a nice scene, but later on in the movie we then see, and some of this again I think is purely in the extended cut, but we see Éowyn, unconscious and not even breathing until Aragorn comes along and does whatever he does to heal her. When did she pass out? When did she become so wounded that she couldn't do anything? Earlier in the movie, what we see is she talks to Theoden, and even after that, she's still running around trying to get away from the big nasty orc that's running the show. I presume that's supposed to be Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul. I don't know for sure. Um, and so she's clearly very active. Her encounter with the Witch King has, clearly done something to her left arm. In the novel, it's made clear that it's broken. In the movie, it's not really clear exactly what her injuries are. But in the novel, it all makes sense. After her encounter with the Witch King, she is afflicted with the Black Breath, which is basically kind of what happens to everybody who gets close to Nazgul in this battle. And they're all, and this includes Mary, who is afflicted to a lesser degree because he kind of came up behind. They all kind of slowly just pass out and become semi-comatose. But, here, Eowyn is basically acting like a normal person who just has a bad arm up until we see her. Suddenly she's just passed out and not even breathing. So it's like, how did she have the energy to talk to Theoden, get up, run around, try to find a sword to defend herself against this other orc, and then suddenly she's just out? And by the way, we know that it doesn't take very long because the last time we see her up and moving around, it's after Aragorn has arrived with the army of the dead, which makes very short work of basically all the orcs. And yet, at the very end of that scene is when we see, and I can't remember if this is only extended cut or not, but we see Éomer come across Éowyn's body thinking she's dead and is just absolutely grief-stricken over it. So we know it didn't take long between when she was up and running around trying to grab a sword and when she's suddenly just unconscious and apparently dead. How does that work? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Like I said, small point, but it makes more sense in the novel where after she kills the Witch King, she is basically immediately, because of her injuries and the Black Breath, kind of just, she's out of it almost immediately, and it's only when Aragorn comes along that they, manage to save her. Whereas here, the way they time everything, it's weird. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, rounding out the stupid. This is the last thing on the list. After the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, we have kind of a council with Gandalf, Éomer, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, where they're basically discussing kind of what to do next. And Gandalf, at this point, is despairing because I've sent him to his death, meaning Frodo, because there are now 10,000 orcs standing between Frodo and Mount Doom, and that's, he's not going to make it. And it's like, okay, I see that you're setting up the scene so that Aragorn can then say, we're going to go out and heroically sacrifice ourselves so we can make sure Frodo makes it. But really, Gandalf never thought about this before? He never thought about the fact that, once you get into Mordor, there's still space to cross before you get to Mount Doom. This is the same Gandalf, by the way, who apparently magically foresaw that there were going to be black ships that Aragorn was going to have to take care of, who could see Frodo magically from a distance, although at this point he can't. Why is it that this Gandalf never had a clue that, once we get there, there's probably going to be armies in Mordor that are going to be in the way, and therefore, there's going to be a problem. Now, in the novel, the way this is played out is a lot more focused on the idea of we just don't want Sauron thinking about his own territory. We don't want him thinking purely about remustering his army, examining his own territory, because once Frodo makes it into Mordor, the odds are pretty high that he's going to know that somebody's in Mordor, and that, of course, is what happens. Because Frodo is captured and because the Mithril Coat and some other things are brought to the Dark Tower, he's aware that there's somebody in Mordor that shouldn't be, and it kind of spooks him out, and it's made clear in the novel that that's the case. And so Gandalf's entire plan, it's Gandalf's plan in the novel, not Aragorn's, his entire plan is focused on making sure that Sauron is looking outward, out from Mordor, not within Mordor. It's not focused on moving the armies, because it's not like you can actually fill up the land of Mordor with armies. Mordor is a big place, okay? So this idea here that Gandalf, for the entirety of 3 movies, never it never crossed his mind that this problem would come up, and now all of a sudden, right here at the end, suddenly he's despairing because, oh, I never thought of that. This is Gandalf. He's been around for a long time. He's a Maya. He's been in Middle Earth for at least a couple thousand years. And you're telling me he never thought about this possibility? Come on, that's a little bit of a stretch. So, that is going to finish up my series on plot changes that Peter Jackson made that created plot holes or otherwise didn't make sense in the movies. Hope you enjoyed that. I have good things to say about the movies and I have bad things to say about the movies, and I try to round it out. So every now and then I'll defend them, every now and then I'll point out where they went wrong, and this was where they went wrong. Now, there's a whole lot of other ways that they went wrong, but that's for another time. So if you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please share it around. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about Tolkien and Middle Earth, or even Tolkien and non-Middle Earth writings and that sort of thing. And you can either subscribe to me here on YouTube, or you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.